Good evening, everybody. For you, it is Wednesday, May 20th. Wednesday, May 20th. Welcome back. We are discussing the prayer life of Jesus, numbers 6 through 8, 6, 7, and 8 of what the gospel tells us about the prayer life of Jesus. Has been in the last year of his ministry. The last one we did, number 9, was the last months of his ministry. And now when we come to number 10, and I'm sure this is the only one we'll get through again, but who's in a hurry, right? This is the Word of God. This is growth time. We're netting out chronologically every time the Gospels teach us that Jesus prayed. We come to John chapter 11. You can find that if you'd like. It is number 10. These are the last weeks of Jesus's earthly ministry, and we've come to Bethany. John chapter 11. If I said, do you know John 11:35? Many of you might be able to say Jesus wept. Shortest verse in the Bible is found in John chapter 11. And with knowing Jesus wept, maybe that'll clue you into what John 11's about. John 11 is, as it begins in verse 1, now a certain man was sick named Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. Verse 3 says, therefore his sisters sent unto him, saying, Lord, behold, whom thou lovest is sick. So the plot of our story today is Lazarus. I'm going to be as detailed as we need to be, but this message isn't about so much the story of Lazarus, but the prayer life of Jesus. But we got to know a few things to understand where we're getting to. So Lazarus is sick. They live in Bethany. Now, Bethany is about 2 miles from Jerusalem, up on the Mount of Olives. The western slope of the Mount of Olives comes down through the Kidron Valley and then up into the city of Jerusalem. If you go over the Mount of Olives to what would be considered the eastern slopes, is where you would find the city of Bethany, only about 2 miles from the city of Jerusalem. Jesus, however, is not in Jerusalem. He's actually over. If you want to go study a map of Israel, you got Jerusalem, and for me, going eastward, about 45, 50, 60 miles or so, there's the Jordan River. Jesus is beyond the Jordan River. Don't take that mileage to heart. I'm second guessing myself. But if you look at a map, you got Jerusalem and then the Jordan River. He's beyond the Jordan River, and Mary and Martha send someone, a messenger, to let Jesus know that Lazarus is sick. If you study the story, by the time he waits where he is for 2 days, and by the time he gets to Bethany, Lazarus has been dead for 4 days. He's been in the grave 4 days. The Jews, buried their dead the same day they die. So, when you look at the timetable, when the messenger leaves Bethany to find Jesus, it's a day's journey. The thought would be that Lazarus probably died on the day that the guy was going to find Jesus, and Jesus stays for 2 days where he was, and then it takes him a day to get from Transjordan to Bethany. So that's the 4 days, and Lazarus has been in the grave. I'm assuming most of you probably know. If you don't, that's fine. But even though he's been dead 4 days, Jesus raises him back to life. So it's not the only time Jesus raised somebody from the dead. He raised the widow at Nain's son. She was a widow, lost her husband. This was her only son, and Jesus happened to be there in Nain, up in the area of Galilee, when the funeral procession comes by, and Jesus stops and goes up and raises the boy back to life and brings him to his mama. What an awesome story. I like that one. Like I say, if there's DVDs in heaven, I want to see that mama's reaction to her son being brought back to her. Had to be the greatest day of her life. The second one is Jairus' daughter, which we referenced the other day when we were talking about Peter, James, and John being the inner circle. Jairus' daughter was one of those that he took those three when he went in the bedroom and raised her up out of her bed. So Lazarus, one might say, is just one of three. But what makes this one a little distinct, maybe not a little, but a lot, is, Jairus' daughter and the widow's son were both within, probably an hour or two, maybe within hours of them dying. Lazarus, 4 days. Even Martha, as we'll see in a minute, when Jesus goes to tell him to move the stone, many of you will remember her famous words were, "By now he stinketh." The decaying process had begun. 4 days without modern embalming methods, just putting spices and ointments. They've probably worn off, and it's pretty rotten in there. And that's what makes this not just one of three. This one's pretty distinct. To raise somebody from the dead after 4 days of decomp is remarkable. It's a little different, but as Jesus gets news of Lazarus's condition, as I said, he waits 2 days, and then it takes him another day to get there. He's been dead 4 days, and when Martha hears, Lazarus has two sisters, Martha and Mary. When Martha hears that Jesus is coming, she takes off running and meets him and says, "If you'd have been here, our brother wouldn't have died." And there's quite an exchange between Jesus and Martha that's really good. I just don't want to take the time to teach on that. That's not the focus today. But you can hear the faith. If you'd have been here, our brother had not died. And then Mary comes. Martha runs back to Mary and gets her. And Jesus doesn't leave where he talks to Martha. It's obvious in this story that Jesus is in no hurry. He knows what's going on. I've used the word omniscient a lot, but he tells us in John 11 verse 4, if you want to look at it, why this is happening. He knows what's going on. He knows what's going to happen. This is the whole purpose. Verse 4 says, when Jesus heard that, he said, "This sickness is not unto death." He does die, but he doesn't stay that way. And Jesus knows that. This sickness is not unto death, but this is what it's for. It's for the glory of God, that the Son of God, he himself, Jesus, might be glorified thereby. This whole event is for God to get glory and for Jesus as his Son to be glorified in it. Okay, but then he also adds another purpose in verse 14. Look at it. It says, "Then said Jesus unto them plainly, Lazarus is dead." And then in verse 15 he says, "And I'm glad." Doesn't seem very nice, does it? But he knows what he's going to do. He says, "I'm glad for your sakes that I was not there, to the intent you may believe. Nevertheless, let us go unto him." Jesus says this whole thing is for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. But secondly, this is also, I'm glad I wasn't there when he got sick and just simply raised him from a sickness like you've seen me do many, many times while you've walked with me. No, I'm glad that I wasn't there, so Lazarus will die, so you can see what I'm going to do so that you can believe. I feel like I want to remind us that it was, it's in the last year, but it's been a few months, no doubt, that Jesus said, who do men say that I am? And then he said, "Who do you say that I am?" And Peter made that infamous statement, "You are the Christ, the Son of God." And Jesus said, "Upon this rock I will build my church." Peter knew then, and he even told him, "Don't tell nobody what you know." So they believed in him, but they needed more belief in him. Sound familiar? I don't know, man. I hear myself in that plainly. I do believe, as the guy says, but help my unbelief. The disciples needed more than to just believe. They needed their faith grown and strengthened, and we all do. And Jesus says this event right here, coming down to the last weeks of us being together, I've been telling you I'm going to die and raise from the dead. But listen, as we get right down to the nitty gritty of it all, me and God are going to have this event happen right before your eyes for this purpose, that I might be glorified as the Son of God, and number two, that your faith will be strengthened, that I am the Son of God. You need to know that. I know you know it, but I need you to know it. And this whole event is for you to grow in your faith. So Jesus first interacts with Martha, who runs to him. We're not told where that was, but wherever she meets him and says, if you'd have been here, our brother wouldn't have died. And they get done with their discussion that you're free to read in John 11. When she goes and tells Mary, that's where we'll pick it up. Verse 33. Verse 32, then when Mary was come where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying unto him, Lord, if thou hadst been here, my brother had not died. She said the exact same thing Martha did. And I don't know about you, do you hear the faith in that? If you'd have been here, our brother would not have died. Meaning they believed he could have healed him, but there's a box around that faith. Which is kind of what you see that this purpose is around the disciples. They believe, but Jesus wants to stretch out that box of belief. And how all of us as saints could use a little faith growth. Martha and Mary both believed Jesus had the power. It's why they sent for him to begin with. It's they have a limit to what they believe he's capable of. Don't we all? With God, Luke 1:37, all things are possible. Let your faith believe that. Never think he's out of options. He can do anything. So this verse 33, when Jesus therefore saw her weeping, and the Jews also weeping which came with her, he groaned in the spirit and was troubled, and said, where have you laid him? And they said unto him, Lord, come and see. And Jesus wept. Learn a verse of the Bible today. Memorization. Jesus wept. And then it says in verse 36, then said the Jews, behold how he loved him. And some of them said, could not this man which opened the eyes of the blind have caused that even this man should not have died? Hear the faith. Hear the faith. They believed he had power. They knew he had opened the eyes of the blind. They even speculated in themselves as they're walking to the gravesite with Mary and Martha and all these Jews that are mourning with them, some professional mourners, some friends of the family, no doubt. They're all moving their way to the grave. And as they're going, this thought is going through people's head. This man could have healed him. Faith. A bunch of faith. But a faith that's lacking total faith. Kind of the streamline of this story. And Jesus and God knew that. And he knew, and God knew, this event needed to transpire because these people, while they had faith, what they're about to go through and watch him go through, and the whole concept of his kingdom is going to be drastically different than they all think it's going to be. They needed something extra. And this whole event, Lazarus died so faith could grow in a multitude of people. Listen to what happens. Verse 38, Jesus therefore again groaning in himself, and notice both times he groans is when he witnesses their grief or sadness based on their thinking that it's hopeless. A lot of people think Jesus wept because of how much he loved Mary. And he did. It even says in the beginning of this story, he loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha. He loved them. They were near and dear to him. But it's not love that's making him weep or groan. It's the lack of faith in the people around him. He hates it that they've put a cap on his power. And he's sad that you and I do that too. And we do. We put a cap on his power. And then he groaned in himself, verse 38, cometh to the grave. It was a cave, and a stone lay upon it, much like Jesus will be buried in. Verse 39, Jesus said, take ye away the stone. And here she comes, Martha, the sister of him that was dead, said unto him, Lord, by this time he stinketh, for he hath been dead 4 days. And, you know, it's almost like it's scripted. He's been dead 4 days. The last thing that's said before Jesus does the miracle from anybody around is he's been dead 4 days and he stinketh. Almost like God and Jesus want that in the narrative. He wants someone to say what they both know. This is not like the widow's son in Nain. This is not like Jairus' daughter. This is extraordinary. It's one thing to raise the dead, and that's pretty cool. But to raise someone who's been dead 4 days, that's super cool. That's super spiritual, supernatural. It is deity at work. Martha says what she says, verse 40. Jesus said unto her, said I not unto thee, and he did earlier in the chapter, that if thou wouldest believe, thou shouldest see the glory of God. If you just have belief that takes the cap off of your faith that you have now, think bigger. Did I not tell you that and he did. Jesus told her, he will rise again. And Martha goes into, yeah, I know, in the resurrection of the dead. You know, she's saying, yeah, I know he's going to come back to life, and but that's down in the future. She didn't even compute Jesus was saying today, right? It didn't even occur to her today. Jesus said, I told you I was going to do this. Why are you acting like that? I wonder how many times he could say that to us. I told you I got you. What are you fretting about? What are you fretting about? I told you I got this. Didn't I say I'd never leave you? Why are you asking me where I went? I'm not gone. Didn't I tell you, as David put it, he's never seen the righteous forsaken or the righteous' seed begging for bread? Didn't I tell you I got you? What were you worried about? Didn't I tell you my ways are not your ways and you're not going to understand me? Didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you that in this world you're going to have tribulation, but you can be of good cheer? I got you. I've overcome the world. Jesus is saying to Martha what he would love to say to every one of us if he could come in our house and sit down with us. Didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you? Didn't I tell you? Why don't you believe me? Then they took, verse 41. Now I want you to just really listen. Notice the details. Then they took away the stone from the place where the dead was laid. And Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, whoa, stop reading. Stop reading. Notice, they take away the stone. Can you see it in the theater of your mind? A couple burly, strong guys, right? They roll the stone away. Martha's over there going, oh, Lord, oh, Lord. You know, if I'm in the crowd, I'm going, what's he doing? Why in the world would he be opening that grave? But you got to know, all eyes are on Jesus and the stone. Jesus and the stone. And it's at this moment, Jesus, before he says anything to what's inside the grave, he doesn't look in there. He looks up there. He lifts his eyes to heaven and he prays. Number 10. In the last weeks of his life, he's praying again. And for the second time, if you're keeping score, it's a public prayer. Do you remember the first one? Right? It was number I don't have it written down, but it's in Matthew chapter 11. Turn there with me. You don't have to, but I want to remind you of that prayer. This is what he said. I thank thee, O Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because thou hast hid these things from the wise and prudent, and hast revealed them unto babes. Sound familiar? I don't want to reteach that, but I just want you to notice this. His first public prayer, he says this, I thank thee, O Father. I want you to see his second public prayer. Verse 41 at the end, he says, Father, I thank thee that thou hast heard me. Isn't it interesting? Both times Jesus prays to God with other people listening. His first words are, Father, I thank thee. Matter of fact, in Matthew, he said, I thank thee, O Father. Sounds like a great message for Thanksgiving, doesn't it? Both times Jesus prayed out loud with people listening. His first practice was to start with thank you. Thank you, thank you, thank you. In this case, he's thanking him that he hears him. Interesting. But notice verse 42. And I know that thou hearest me always. You listen to me every time I ever talk to you. And then he says, but because of the people which stand by, I said it, that they may believe that thou hast sent me. Here's where we're at in the story. The stone's gone. The door's open. Jesus is about to holler for Lazarus to come forth. But in that interim, where everybody has hushed, can you imagine the anticipation that was in the hearts and minds of those people standing around? And remember who's standing around. It's the disciples, it's Mary and Martha, and it's all those Jews, and we don't know the number, but it's all these professional mourners that were notorious in those days, but also all these close friends who had been there to comfort them during their mourning process. They're all there. They're all standing there, mouth open. I'm sure mine would... Right. And as they're anticipating what comes next, Jesus takes a minute while they're listening to say, Daddy, thank you that you listen to me. And I know you listen to me all the time, but I said that so these people standing around here would hear me say it, right? I'm not doing this on my own. I'm doing it through you and with you. We are one. I am your son. Remember, Jesus told the disciples 4 days ago that the whole purpose of this was that God might be glorified and the Son of God glorified thereby. Now he's praying, God, I'm thanking you for this occasion. That these people are about to watch me and you do what me and you can do. And I want them to know you and I are one. I am God, you are God. We are the same. I know you hear me. I just wanted them to hear me talk to you, knowing that you and I are doing this together. And with them hearing that, they might believe that thou hast sent me. I want them to hear it so they will know and believe that you and I are connected. You sent me here. He's doing it for them. So what happens? And when he had thus spoken, he cried with a loud voice, Lazarus, come on. Right? And then it says in verse 44, and he that was dead came forth, bound hand and foot with grave clothes, and his face was bound with a napkin. And Jesus said unto them, loose him and let him go. He comes hopping out, right? His hands and feet are bound. His head's covered, probably bouncing off stuff, right? He back from the dead. Here he comes, just like Moses. I remember saying about Moses and Elijah the other day, back from the dead. Here he comes. And Jesus says, loose him and let him go. What a moment. What a moment. And notice how John summarizes verse 45. Then many of the Jews which came to Mary and had seen the things which Jesus did, believed on him. So what Jesus prayed for God to do, let them believe on him, and guess what? They did, many of them. Verse 46 says, but some of them went their ways to the Pharisees and told them what things Jesus had done. Here's the bottom line. I don't want to get caught up in chasing a rabbit, but you can't miss that in this story. Some of them believed, some of them didn't. They both watched the same thing. How in the world do you walk away from a 4-day-old decomposing body and not believe? But some of them didn't. Matter of fact, their loyalties were to the Pharisees, and they ran to tattletale on Jesus to the Pharisees. They didn't see the event as my heart is open. And can I tell you, the ones that did believe is because God opened their heart. He predestined this moment for them to be there so that he could show them they could believe on him, and they did. But the ones that he didn't move it, it's just like 1 Corinthians chapter 1 when Paul says, I preach Christ crucified. To the Jews, it's a stumbling block. To the Greeks, it's foolishness. But to them that are called, it's the wisdom and power of God. You could apply those verses right here. Jesus could say, I brought the dead back to life. You remember the story about the rich man and Lazarus? Lazarus died and went to Abraham's bosom. The rich man lifted his eyes in hell, and he begged Abraham to send somebody back to talk to his brothers. And Abraham told him, even though someone from the dead tell them, they still wouldn't believe. They had Moses and the prophets. That's all, the law and the prophets. That's all they need. And here again, even though somebody raises from the dead, they still won't believe. Folks, the reason we believe is because God gave us the gift of faith that we could believe. Just like this story, Jesus and God knew the people needed it. That's why they did it. He knew what I needed, and he went that far to get me to believe. I had my moment when I was 6 years old. I don't know how old you were, but I had my moment where God brought something up that made my eyes and my mind open up that he's real, and I believed, and that saved my soul. Saved my soul. I didn't understand Jesus and the blood, really. I didn't. I may have heard it, but I didn't understand what the blood does. I think there's a lot of people that's 50 years old and 60 years old that still don't understand the blood of Jesus and how that saves us. We just know it's true, right? I didn't understand justification. I couldn't have spelled it, let alone tell you what it meant. I couldn't have spelled sanctification, let alone propitiation, right? I mean, if you'd asked me any of those things at the altar when I came to get saved at 6 years old, what do they mean? I wouldn't have had a clue. But I knew I needed to be saved, and God got me there at 6. My mind didn't get me there. My heart did. And God is dealing with hearts, not eyes, because I'm telling you, if it was all about eyes, who wouldn't have believed? It's something in here, not something here. And Jesus prayed and said, God, I'm so glad you listened to me. Thank you. I know you do. And I didn't say it because I'm surprised you do. I said it so they would hear our connection. This is about you and me and them believing on us and what we're doing here. I come from you down to this earth to save them, help them to believe. Not only did people believe then, if you go to chapter 12, which is a few weeks later, it's Saturday night, evening, before Palm Sunday, which is the Sunday before Easter Sunday. It says in verse 9, this is John 12:9. Much people of the Jews, therefore, knew that he was there at Mary. He's back at Mary and Martha's a few weeks later. They came not for Jesus' sake only, but that they might see Lazarus also, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests consulted that they might put Lazarus also to death. The chief priests want to kill everybody that doesn't believe in them but believes in Jesus. That's what depravity is. They don't see Jesus as the Son of God. They don't recognize he can raise 4-day dead people to life. They're blinded to that because the God of this world, Satan, has blinded them. And they can't, how in the world can you hate a life giver? Right? The chief priests want to kill Lazarus. The people who believe want to just sit in his presence, believing and knowing. And it says in verse 11, because that by reason of him, Lazarus, many of the Jews went away and believed on Jesus. So it didn't just happen on the day that Jesus prayed, let them believe, but now we find a few weeks later on Palm Sunday, the Saturday night before, it's saying people are still believing on it because they've heard of the miracle. And then verse 17 of chapter 12 of John says, the people therefore that was with him when he called Lazarus out of the grave and raised him from the dead bear record. For this cause the people also met him, for that they heard that he had done this miracle. And listen to the Pharisees. This is Palm Sunday. This is how the crowd come off of the Mount of Olives with Jesus into Jerusalem. Those people throwing the palm branches and singing Hosanna. The reason they're doing this is because Lazarus was called out of the grave, and they bear record of this. And the Pharisees, listen, last verse. The Pharisees therefore said among themselves, perceive ye how we prevail nothing. Behold, the world is gone after him. That crowd, all of those people that believed on him and were calling him Hosanna, the Messiah, you know why? Because Lazarus come out of the grave. And do you know how? Do you really believe for a second Jesus knew before he even left the Transjordan area and walk a day to get to Bethany, knowing Lazarus would have been dead 4 days by the time he got there, before it ever happens, he's saying this is not unto death. Meaning he's going to die, but he's not going to stay that way. Jesus knew then what was going to happen. He said, this is all for the glory of God. I know I've said this 3 times. Listen to the beauty of this thing we call our Christian faith. Jesus knew then Lazarus wouldn't stay in the grave. He's doing it for the belief of all the other people. And he knows and he prays, God, let them believe, let them believe, let them believe. And knowing some of them are going to believe, and not just that day, but it's going to stir in their hearts so much that on Palm Sunday, they're going to bring Old Testament scriptures to life, that they're going to walk before him, how he comes lowly, sitting upon the donkey, the foal of a donkey. And all of that's going to be fulfilled because God orchestrated Lazarus dying on the day he died. He put it in Mary and Martha's heart to send for him so he would show up just in time. And he even orchestrated in a theatrical way, just before the stones rolled away, a voice from humanity. Martha represents all of us saying, what? He's been dead 4 days. He stinketh. If you could translate that, that's saying, you can't do that. That is not possible. Even God says, say it now. You're right. With men, it's not possible. But with God, all things are possible. Jesus' second public prayer is just like the first one. God, I'm here to thank you. I'm here to thank you for who you are, how you do things, the way you do things, and when you do things, and the love you have for me and for these people. And I'm saying this right now while they got their mouths open, wondering what I'm going to do next. I'm going to say out loud what's more important than what I'm about to say next. More important than Lazarus come forth is, Lord, I'm thanking you that they hear me talk to you so that they may believe you've sent me. That's what matters more. Not whether Lazarus lives again, but whether the people standing around, the ones he's drawn and called from eternity past, finally make it home. When Jesus prayed in public, it was to God, so that the people listening could grow. He never prayed long prayers to be seen of men. He prayed because he had a desire for people to look up. He looked up when he prayed. And I bet everybody, you ever see somebody, you can mess with people, just all of a sudden go, and whoever's with you are going to go, because they're going to want to know what you're looking at. When Jesus, as it says, verse 41, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, Can you imagine when Jesus, after he said, take the stone away, and people are watching that, and he waits for him to get done. So all the attention goes from the two stone rollers, or however many it took. Their eyes go from that to him, because, you know, the ball's now in his court. Stone's gone. What's he going to do? And as they're all looking at him, Jesus looks up to his Father. And I guarantee you, every single person looked up with him. You can't help it. When he looked up, they looked up. And Jesus wants us all looking up. It's our life. It's how our faith grows, is by looking up. All right, so we've gotten from his first year to his second year to his last year to the last months, and now we've done the last week, the last weeks, and starting Sunday, next Sunday, the 24th, we'll talk about his last days. The closer he gets to the cross, and then from the cross, his prayer life just keeps getting more amplified. And I got to tell you, the next one is pretty cool to think about. Love you guys. Don't forget, Sunday, the 24th, 4 o'clock, we're meeting at the church in the gym, not the church, the gym. And if weather permitting, not rain and downpour, we're going to have the two big side doors open on the side of the gym, so we don't even have to walk in the church, through the church, get close. We can walk through them big doors and go in and find a seat that'll be nicely spaced. So, Lord willing, we'll see you there. Love you guys. Bye-bye.